Can you imagine trying to read an entire novel that's printed only on one page? Application dashboards are the same. They're like little windows into our data, and it's just way more comfortable and natural not to have to digest information in one big chunk. Speed is also another big consideration. If an app is designed to load all of its records up front, performance may be impacted negatively. It's the main reason why Microsoft put app data row limits in place for Power Apps. Can you imagine an app retrieving 100,000 records over the web at once and applying a filter to it? I'm sure if you could do it, then some people would, but the reality is the web is just not designed that way. It's why all web APIs have data throttling in place. So what's the best way to get around these data row limits? Well, in the end, it comes down to one thing, and that is significantly reducing the amount of records we request from our data connections at any one time. In the case of Power Apps, we already know there's a max limit of 2,000 rows we must adhere to. Let's take a look at how we can use paging on our data grids and galleries to reduce the number of records our app requests at any one time, while still allowing for the user to browse an entire record set if they wish. Okay, let's dive in. So I've got my demo app open here, and you can see in the middle of the screen I have what looks like a really pretty nice looking dashboard. Now you might be thinking, this is interesting, I haven't seen this control before in Power Apps. And hey, look, he's got some page controls here, which is, I haven't seen that before. This doesn't really look like a gallery either, like not what I'm used to. How has this been done? What sort of witchcraft is this? Well, it's no witchcraft. This is all, believe it or not, this is all out of the box. And what you're looking at here is a gallery that has been laid out and designed in a grid formation. And if you haven't done this before, I actually recently did a video on creating data grids and doing inline editing in data grids, which is sort of quite complementary to this video. So I'll link to that at the end of this video if you wanted to watch it. And so yeah, definitely stay tuned to the cards at the end. You'll see that. Otherwise, you can feel free to browse through my channel and you'll see that video in there. Now, like I said, this is a gallery, and in conjunction with Flow, or as it's called now, Power Automate, and Power Apps, we can achieve this result where we can have paging and page data from SharePoint. And there's lots of advantages in doing this. One, we're not just displaying all of our records up until our data row limit all in one go. Now this is, or we're not having to automatically have to filter our data down to under our data row limit to make sure that we're, we're not hitting that undelegable queries as well, because that's the other concern is that, and if you've watched that my video on delegable queries, you'll know that they're a big problem when you start getting undelegable warnings, because you won't be able to see all your filtering in your queries you're not necessarily seeing all your records or the correct data in your dashboard. Now, this method effectively gets around that, because what you're doing is you are now looking at the entire data. Now, it is possible to filter this even further and filter it any way you like, regardless of if those queries are delegable or not, because now that you're breaking these queries up into pages that are going to be under your row limit, you're always going to be filtering and querying the full data. So before we actually drill into the nuts and bolts of this, let me give you a quick outline of how this works. So we've got Power Apps here, and Power Apps will call Flow. So it's Flow that makes the HTTP request to SharePoint and the SharePoint list. So this is what it looks like. So here is our URI parameter. Now this gets passed from Power Apps and gets passed to Flow, and Flow sets the URI parameter in this HTTP request to the SharePoint list. what that does is it returns back a JSON object containing the SharePoint list items in an array, but as well, it also includes a string, and the string is the URI parameter or the URI string for the next page of results. So if we dissect this a little bit, we can see our initial URI has this parameter here called top equals 5. And what I'm saying there is I want to return all the items back from the inventory list and I want to include the title, ID, stock, part number, and supplier and date value columns only. Plus, I only want to return the top 5, meaning the first 5 records in the list. And what this does is, it does return the first 5 records, but it also returns back, gives me a URI parameter for the next 5 records after these 5. So effectively, I've got the parameter for my next query to SharePoint. What happens next is Flow sends that object back to Power Apps. So let's take a look at how we initialize our data grid or gallery for paging. So the first thing we do, and we can do this as a refresh button or on app load or any way you really want, or even when the screen loads. In my example, I will show you after this outline, you'll see that I've done it with a refresh button. So the first thing I do is I set a variable that will be used to display the page number, and that is effectively just a variable that I can increment or decrement as I go up and down through the pages. And I'm setting that to 1 because I'm initializing this gallery, and this will be the first page that we're looking at. The next thing I do is I create a collection that will store our URI page history. So what this does is it will always store the current page that we're looking at, so we can keep a track or a stack of all the addresses or all the URI parameters that we need to traverse back and forward through our list items. So we can go next, or previous, and basically we push onto the stack, or we pop off our history stack. The next thing we do, we set a variable for our first page of results. That's our URI variable that we're going to send to Flow. Now, as you saw in my outline there, our first URL will just be saying that we want to see the top 5 records. That parameter doesn't necessarily have to be 5. You can make it any number you wish, but just keep in mind that the row limit for Power Apps is a maximum of 2,000. So if you set it to any higher than that, you won't return back all the records that you're querying. Next thing we do is we call Flow, and we pass that URI parameter to Flow, which will return back our JSON object. The last thing we do is initialize our collection that is used for our item property for our gallery, and that's been returned from Flow, and that will display our items to our dashboard or our grid. So our next page function, first thing we want to do is we want to check if our page history is blank. So that's our collection, our page history collection. So we check if that is blank. And if it is, we want to effectively initialize our history, and we want to put that first page back in there. So we push onto our page history stack, the very first page of 5 records. So our URI for our first 5 records. Otherwise, we just want to store our current URI or our current HTML parameter onto our history. We then set our URI variable or our current URI variable to our __ next value that's stored in the return result. Now that __ next value is what I was talking about before, is a part of the JSON object that's returned back from our SharePoint web service call. So we get 2 parts to that object. There's an array, which is all of our list items, and there's that next parameter. So they're the 2 properties that are a part of that JSON object. And all we're doing here is we're setting a variable in Power Apps to be that next object. We also need to do a little bit of string manipulation on that as well, because unfortunately SharePoint sends back the entire URL, including the https // the entire URL. And you really, for Flow, for that URI parameter, we just want to show everything from the /_API onwards. So we need to do a little bit of string manipulation on that before we send it to Flow. We pass that URI variable to Flow, and then we initialize the collection that is used for our property, for our gallery. So again, our collection that our gallery items are based on, we initialize that again, or we clear collect that with the returned result from Flow. And we increment our current page variable. So when we're doing previous page, the first thing we want to do is we want to call Flow, and we want to pass the last URI value that's been stored in our history collection. So the very last one that has been stored in that collection, we want to pass that value to Flow as the URI of our previous, because it's our history, right? Then we want to set the URI variable to the next value stored in return results. So that value that comes back from Flow, again, we just want to set our URI that we're going to pass to Flow. If we click next again, we want to set that to the next value that's returned back from Flow. And again, we have to do that string manipulation. So very similar to when in the previous step when we're doing next, but this is basically, we've done a previous, but the result, it's the same Flow we've called and the result's the same. So we want to remove that last record in the history collection stack. So we want to delete that off that last record because it's no longer the last record now. And we're at the previous, because we're popping and pushing onto a stack, our previous value in there is the correct value for our history, because we're maintaining that as we're pushing and popping off that history stack. The second last thing we want to do is initialize the collection that is used for the items property for our gallery with the return result from Flow. So then we just want to display those results. And the very last thing we do is decrement the current page variable. So let's take a quick look at the flow that's doing all of our SharePoint heavy lifting for us. The first item is just we're calling it from Power Apps, so that is pretty straightforward. We just want our call from Power Apps SharePoint activity. Next thing we want to do is set initialize a variable, and all we're doing is initializing that to the variable that was sent to Power Apps, I should say. So we're just we're getting that from that first step, and that's the variable we send to our flow from Power Apps. This next step is the step I showed you before in my outline, and this is the HTTP request to SharePoint. So the first parameter is our site address. And we're doing a get method because we're just getting items from the SharePoint list. And we're in the URI, we're setting that to our variable that we're setting, which it ultimately comes from our Power Apps parameter. The next step we're doing is we're just setting another variable, but this time this is an object. And the object will be the returned result from our HTTP request. So that, like I said, this returns a JSON object. Our SharePoint API returns a JSON object, and this is just setting a variable to the return result, so just to the body. And if I just highlight that, you can see what the function is that I use. It says body open brackets, open quotes, SP list. Let me quickly show you that. If I get rid of that and I go into expression, all I do there is just use body, open quote, close quote, and in here it'll be SP, the name of the action that I'm returning. So the last action here is a response, and what this will do is this will return the JSON object back to Power Apps as a JSON object. And the response action here, we have to give it a schema. And the way we can generate this is, it's pretty straightforward. We can use this little function here that's built into this action. And it is, if we click on use sample payload to generate schema, in here we can paste a dummy payload that comes back from our SharePoint list. Now, if you want an easy way to get that payload or get an example of that payload, if you haven't got that at hand, we can, the easy way to do that is just go to a previous example of where you've run this flow, and under the SP list action here, we can see the result of body that is returned back. It's a huge big JSON kind of object string. And if we just copy all of that, well, actually we don't have the option if we right click. So if we just select all of that and Control C on my keyboard, let's go back and edit that flow. We'll go into response, show advanced options, use payload to generate schema. And here I just paste that in there, click done. That generates that schema for us. So that's pretty straightforward way to get the response working correctly with and sending a correct response and working with that data that's coming from SharePoint. So what this will do is this will format that as a JSON object, as a proper object that Power Apps then can work with. So let's take a look at initializing our gallery first off. And like I said before, I've used a refresh button to do that. Just drag this down. We can see our steps here. So our first step is setting our variable, our current page variable, and we set that to 1. And then we initialize our page history collection. And I've just called that col page history. And I've just given that a dummy string, but then I clear it so it's completely empty. The next step is I'm setting our URI variable to our first page string. So I've just got an additional parameter here, or additional part of the string here that I'm getting from our number per page, and that's just so I can set the number of items per page, but you don't need this. This can just say that if you want. If you don't want to also have the ability to be able to set a different page number. The next step, I am calling flow, and I'm setting the variable is the return result. So that's going to contain the object that's returned back from flow. And here's where I call flow. And here I'm passing that URI path parameter. And that's just going to return our first 5 records from SharePoint. Last thing I do here is I just initialize our collection, that col page table, and that holds all of our items for our gallery. And I'm just setting this to page results.d.results. Now this is the structure of the JSON object that if you've used SharePoint API before, you'll know this is quite familiar. And basically all this is the page result is the JSON object, and I have to drill in to get to the array that contains all the list items, and the array is called results. So I'm not sure why it initially puts it under a D object, but this is the way SharePoint structures it. So this is what we have to do to get to the array. So page results.d.results, and we set that array to our items collection. So the next item button, the first thing we do is we check if the first item in the page history collection is blank. So we're effectively checking, is that collection blank? If it is, then initialize it by pushing onto the page collection history stack, or pushing in the first record into that collection. And I do that by clear collecting that the first value, or the first page in our SharePoint list. if the first record in the collection is not blank, then we just want to push the current page, the current URI that we've set to history, because we want to remember where we are in the stack and we want to push our current page to the stack. The next thing we do, we want to set that URI path now to the new page result, or the next page URI that we've gotten from our page return result from Flow. And this is where we have to do our little string manipulation here that gets rid of our first part of our URI or URL address and just gives us everything from /API onwards. So the next thing we do is and this is pretty much the same as when we're initializing it, we have to run Flow, and we're setting our page result to the result returned back from Flow with that new URI, which is the next, remember it's come from our next value. And all we need to do then is just set our col page table, which is the collection that we're using to display the items in the gallery. We're just setting that to page results d results, which is the array returned back from Flow. And the last thing we do is we increment the current page. So when we're browsing to a previous page, the first thing we want to do is actually call Flow and set our page result to we're setting it to the last value that's stored in our page history. So the very last page that we browsed to and we stored to the page history stack, we want to run Flow and get those results back. Next thing we want to do is we want to set our URI path. So this will be the next part. This is the URI path of when next time we hit next. So we're setting it to the next value that's returned back from our page result. And we have to do that string manipulation on that again. So the next thing we want to do is we want to remove that last history record from our page history collection. So I'm just saying, give me back all the rows from page history, starting from row 1 to how many rows there are in the collection -1, which just removes the last row in the collection. And then I'm just setting that to col page history. So I'm resetting that to that value. The last thing I want to do here, the second last thing is I want to set the col page table, which is, like I said, is the table that we use to display our results in our gallery. And I'm setting that to the result that's returned back from our last Flow call. And I just decrement the var current page. So they're the three operations that you really need to put in place before you can get paging working in your gallery. Now, the other couple things that you need to do here is that you need to make sure that these buttons are disabled or enabled when we've reached we want to make sure that is enabled when we reach page 1, or when we don't have any more previous pages in history to browse to. And we want to make sure that our next button is disabled when we reach the end of our data connection, when there's no more next items in the list. So let's take a look at previous first. How do we do that? So in the display mode, all we want to do is that we're looking at our history and we're seeing if our page history collection is blank. So that's sort of one way we could have done it. We could have just said var current page is equal to 1, display mode disabled. Otherwise it's edit. So effectively what that says is if we're on page 1, we can't go any further back. Now for the next button, if we just take a look at the display on that, display mode I should say. Now we're looking to see if our parameter that's returned back from flow, our underscore underscore next parameter, is blank. So what happens is if when we call flow and we get the JSON object back, if our underscore underscore next property inside of our object does not have anything in it, so there's no next URI that's returned back from our API call, then there's no more pages in our data connect, or there's no more data left to show from our list. We've traversed our entire list and there's no more results to return back. So we want to disable that button. Otherwise, there's more data to go because we've got this has been refreshed with a new value and we can click on next. So let's see that in action again. So here's our page one. If we click next, we get our next page and our increment counter has gone to 2. We can go backwards and go back to page 1. We can't go any further because we're at page 1. Go to page 2, we go to page 3, and now because I know there's only 13 records in our list, we can't go any further. So that's the big subject of paging covered. If there's anything you'd like me to clarify further, please leave your comment in the comments section. And of course, if there's another subject you'd like me to cover on this channel, also comment that in the comments section. I thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.